Hello, hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? You ready to do some code stuff? Yeah? Hello, hello, everyone. Nice to see everyone. Happy Friday or Saturday, if that happens to be your time zone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Nice to see everyone all blowing up the chat as usual. Very exciting. And so thanks to those of you who have been tuning in pretty much all month on our exploration of open source from first principles. We covered the basic whys in our first session with Eddie and Andrea and got hands-on into securing your code with Will in the last session. And today we're going to cap the conversation with my guests for the day, Natalie Bradley and Zack Koppert. Natalie is the Director of Professional Services and Zachary is the Senior DevOps Engineer. Natalie, let's go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, AJ. Hello, everyone. Super excited to be here to talk to you all about open source program offices. So many people reach out to us at GitHub to talk about how they should manage their open source projects, what their usage should look like. So I'm excited for us to share some guidance with you all today. And even more excited to spend some time with Zack Koppert. He is an open source pro. He's been helping many large enterprises in public sector, in commercial industries, and is going to share all the good, the bad, and the ugly with us today. Quick intro of myself. AJ mentioned I am a regional director for a professional services organization. I help our customers get the best experience with GitHub. Prior to GitHub, I was a technical advisor working with many large organizations to help them build better software. And of course, open source and inner source are key to those objectives. So Zack, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive in?
Yeah, that sounds awesome. So yeah, OSPOs are really close to my heart, open source programs offices. So I'm excited to be talking about this today. I actually have founded one inside an older, very traditional tech company and sort of gone through the fires that way. And so I love talking with other folks about, that experience and going through that. And I'm also in the professional services organization at GitHub. And so my job involves a lot of consulting with other companies just on how to manage your open source, what's going on with inner source and how does that fit in. And then also I maintain a couple of open source projects myself. And so it's really important to me from that perspective, how large enterprises interact with my open source and their expectations of my projects.
Awesome. So you've got all the experience lined up, and we've got a really good chat set up here. For any of you that are in the audience, feel free to drop questions in the chat on the topic of OSPOs, and we'll try to get them answered for you live today. We'll mix it up with some real world examples, your questions, and Zack's experiences. So with that, let's get down to it. Zack, let's start with the basics. Just level set for us all here. What is an open source program office?
Okay, so an open source programs office is going to be normally a team of people, sometimes only one person, but normally a team inside an organization, and they're going to be responsible for all things open source, right? It's this central hub for whether you are consuming inner source or producing an open source project, or some government customers of yours want to know what open source is in your projects, and policies for legal, all of that sort of thing. So in sort of real world examples for folks that don't have an open source programs office, the types of questions that lead to creating it is like, okay, a developer might ask, am I allowed to reuse this code inside of a company project, this code being some open source project? And how did they know? How did they figure that out? Or some legal folks might be wondering about a product that recently released and say, well, what legal agreements do we have? What legal liabilities do we have around this part of the code, or this code that we didn't write, or code from a partnership, or different things like that. And OSPOs really help navigate and traffic control all of the different networks in terms of the legal, engineering, business leadership and decisions, open source, inner source, when to do which, and how to protect your private code as well.
Awesome. So it's it's a group of people that are really defining that process in your organization. So you don't kind of have every man for themselves, or a group over here doing it one way and somebody over here kind of doing whatever they want a different way. Okay. So is this just for tech companies? Like, are they the leaders of this? Is this where an OSPO fits best?
Yeah, so tech companies, I think, is the obvious yes. Of course, most large tech companies have open source programs offices, or they're thinking about them. There have been some surveys that have come out from the Linux Foundation just about that increasing wave of tech companies sort of growing and doing that. But it is definitely not just for tech companies. So if you look at a couple of different industries that are traditionally non-tech, low-tech, or maybe they're increasing or investing in tech. You look at banking and financial services. You've got Capital One with a very well-established, active, open source programs office. You've got Fannie Mae. You've got media companies too, right? So if you switch gears again, you've got Verizon Media, Comcast, or looking at sort of some of my favorite examples is just like governments and universities, which are normally, think about an organization being protective of their IP. Well, governments are even more protective and locked down in a sense with high security. But City of Paris is out there, working in open source and helping their not only just consuming but producing. And they've got an OSPO. Department of Veterans Affairs, U.S. GSA, General Services Administration. And then on the university side, you've got Johns Hopkins, RIT. I could go on and on. There's a ton of them out there. And those are all, again, kind of non-traditional tech scenes.
That's awesome. So if we're basically talking about every company starting to embrace open source, it's all over the place, but do you need to be established in open source to start an OSPO? Like, why would you start one?
Yeah. So what the industry has found from several different surveys is really that there's this 97% number, right? 97% of companies are building their technology platforms, their products, their services by using open source. Sometimes there's not a lot of awareness from the leadership level, because they're not the ones including this, time zone library so that time zones automatically get converted in your product or service. But the developers know this, they're the ones that are including that library and writing that code. And so with 90% of products or services being built on top of open source, that means that, well, your organization is likely, very likely using open source. And that can be a great reason to start an open source programs office, because you've already got something to manage. You've already got legal liabilities to manage with the licenses and projects that you're consuming in your products. And that's a great place to start implementing policy. And well, what's going to be allowed? Are we going to allow some of these more infectious or copyleft license projects into our code, which is a whole nother topic we might get into later. But yeah, it doesn't take much. If you're an organization operating today and you're even not producing but using technology, you're probably using open source.
So it's a big deal for an organization, but it probably is beneficial for those that are just starting off, so they're not getting themselves into too much trouble further down the line. Do you have any experience with like recommending one or setting one up in an organization in your previous life?
Yes. So I have done this before, and so the story goes, I was a software manager at a previous company, and I was assigned to a new team. So I just switch onto a team. I've got a bunch of, senior developers and up that are reporting to me. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I have some one-on-ones with them and figure out like, hey, what you working on? Catch me up to speed. The new kid here. And so talking to one of the developers, actually, it turns out that they're working on an embedded web server. So I don't know if you're familiar with the web server scene in open source, but there's like a jillion of them. Some of them are really well established, really well thought out. if you want one with every feature under the sun, or if you want one that's very minimal and can run on small embedded systems, it's all available out there, right? And big communities around these. And so I'd asked, this very experienced developer, like, hey, did we consider, open source options on this? How long have you been working on this? What kind of effort are we putting into it? Just to feel out the scene. And he was saying like, well, it's about a 9-month project overall. We're 6 months in. We got 3 more months. And, we didn't really consider open source because, well, I don't know if you know, but open source is kind of like, Stack Overflow, or like just developers on Google spitting out code that might not work. So like, it's pretty low quality. We don't have time for that. And, we're a very long-lived tech company. We have high standards for quality, and anything that we do here is going to be better than what's out there. I just had to let that soak in, like, okay, this is not my understanding of open source and how it works, nor my experience with some projects out there that are just rock solid. And so, after having conversations about like, well, have you heard of TensorFlow? Like, it's a pretty big deal. It's pretty well established. Have you heard of Kubernetes? It's pretty well established. It's very high quality. These are open source projects, and we're not using code snippets. We're using whole projects. So like, there's some room. Anyways, there's a whole long story about that specific issue, but that was really what led me to saying, I think we need to figure out how to sort of maximize at this organization our use of open source. Digging around that a little bit more, I actually found that there were multiple departments. Sometimes you have product line A, product line B, product line C, but they're all under one company, right? And they need to have a similar look and feel, similar functionality. And so looking across all of those code bases, though, with some architects, you find that, the UI from here is not the UI from there, but we work really hard to make them try to look like each other. But, the technology stack sometimes allows you to reuse the code there. So you start to see these patterns of reuse that are opportunities, right? To reuse code more often across your product portfolio. That's going to help your engineering efficiency go up if you're not rewriting things over and over, reinventing the wheel, so to speak. And so, that inner source opportunity paired together with the, we really need to consume more open source because we have this culture here that says, well, if it's invented here, it's better than out there, the other, right? That led me to put together a proposal, talk to my manager and director about it, and eventually the president of the company, and just say, hey, I think this is a big opportunity for us to digitally disrupt ourselves and transform a little bit into a newer company and be a more efficient one in terms of engineering. And I think this is really going to propel us forward. I put some numbers together and talked about what open source programs look like out in the wild, what other people had already put together. And it was pretty wild, the response. I really didn't expect it, but they were like, okay, go for it. We want you to do it. Like, oh,
no pressure.
Okay. I just joined this new team, and then now I gotta start planning this other direction. So it was a lot of fun to establish that and to help out with that. That's kind of the story of how I ended up getting into this. And then now I'm at GitHub and consulting with tons of different open source programs offices to help them get up and running, or even just patch certain areas that they're struggling with.
That's awesome. So for anyone listening that's interested in this, you fought the good fight, right? Brought it to their attention, kind of opened their eyes to it and realized it. But how would an organization actually go about starting an OSPO inside their company? Like what are those steps they need to take? So somebody said, yeah, this is what we need. Where do you go from there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you're looking to start an OSPO, it can be sort of a complex topic because just like you can imagine that an engineering organization at company A and company B, they don't do the same thing, right? They do what the company needs them to do. And so, not to give a non-answer here, but it's a little bit similar with the open source programs office, right? If you have more of a compliance heavy industry, well, okay, getting started on your policy, working with your legal team, and really outlining what legal risk is acceptable and what needs to be mitigated, and developer training for how to use open source might be your steps and your focus. And then if you, let's say, have, again, another maybe very large organization, and developer productivity is really unwieldy, like you're just not sure what people are working on and things like that, then focusing on producing open source and writing policies for that, encouraging folks to do that, and maybe even applying a little bit of pressure for folks to open source can really do some amazing things, like clean up your code. All of a sudden there's wonderful documentation because, oh my gosh, this is going to be open source. Or, some of the folks where, sorry for the analogy, but they know where the bodies are. They know where the skeletons are hiding in the code. Those all of a sudden get cleaned up, even though maybe they've been sitting there for 15 years, just at the mere opportunity of open sourcing it. So, I would say overall, though, in terms of like actually starting one, with it being so different, the biggest things that I can give you for that should be on your like starting plan, your outline, is clear goals, right? And a clear definition of what you're going to do. When I went to my manager and up the chain to propose an open source programs office, I was very succinct in just 2-3 sentences about what I was going to do and the impact that it was going to have. So I'd like to start this small organization with 3 folks who are going to be dedicated to managing our open source presence publicly, our inner source code sharing internally, and working with legal and marketing to help manage our identity in the developer world. It's very succinct, very sort of goal-oriented. And the ask is there, right? About what is it I need to be able to accomplish this impact. And then hopefully, go ahead.
Sorry, that's going to be very specific to, that could be a totally different goal for a different organization, right? It's just as long as you've got a goal, something to set your boundaries with, like an expectation.
Yep. And hopefully you're pitching that to some leader that is going to, in return, kind of sponsor you and say, yes, this is aligned with our company goals, this is aligned with our current priorities, and it fits in our timeline here. And then they're going to be the executive champion, so that later on down the road, if you weren't to have gotten that approval, you sort of did this grassroots thing, which is great, but you don't want to leave it grassroots, right? Because then they might look and go, okay, if I'm looking at time cards here, I'm looking at Jira, and I see that everybody seems to be spending about 10% of their time on these open source collaboration projects that just aren't tied to revenue. Like, cut that out, because they don't understand the goals and the benefits of doing it. They might see it pop up as a potential, leaky vessel, like, oh, we're wasting time here. And so you really want to get that sponsorship, and then write out a plan about how you're going to achieve those goals, right? If the legal risk is really your concern, chart a course from where you're at today to creating a policy that's going to help you standardize on how to use open source and license acceptability and all of that.
So it's a good amount of meaningful work, but it's a good amount of work to pull this together. Yep. Setting your goals, that leadership support is definitely, sounds like it's definitely a lot more than just pat on the back. Yeah, Zach, you got this, but actually something that they'll back you and support you and ensure that people understand the messaging, and then a full plan. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? How are we going to establish this? Earlier, you had mentioned the legal issues, the security issues. We're talking about corporate IP. So I assume that this group is actually going to be responsible for policy, like actually create and determine and decide, like, this is the process, these are the policies we're following. How do they know what policies to create? Is this like someone in legal is going to tell them, like, this is what we can and can't do? Or How does somebody know who's setting this up? How do they create policy?
Yeah. So obviously, in terms of policy process and creating a standard operating procedure, or officially putting something as like, oh, this is official policy versus like a recommendation from some department that nobody knows about, it's going to be different in every organization. So you have to know how your leadership works, how enforcement works, to be able to sort of standardize on these things. And there are tools for that as well, right? In terms of discovering what you're using in terms of open source, like Dependabot and different things like that, or being able to, sort of accumulate and look at the licenses that those have and whether that matches up with your policy or not. So in terms of going about writing policy, though, this should never, ever, ever, ever be done in a vacuum, right? Or in a silo. So policy should have legal there, but it shouldn't be only legal. They should have developers there because they're going to be the ones that have to live with the, weight of developing under this load, right? But then also business leadership, making those business decisions about like, okay, I feel comfortable for my product line taking this amount of risk or innovating in this area, but I want to avoid that, or, that they need to be in the room too. So it needs to be a very diverse group that's coming up and agreeing or approving these policies. And then there's some mechanics about putting those in place and enforcement as well. In terms of like what the policy should actually be, again, aligned with your goals. But I guess one thing to mention is that there are other open source programs offices out there. So if you were to, try and do this in your organization, you don't have to do this alone, right? And because open source offices are sort of into like sharing and being open and transparent, which is great, several of them have shared what their policy documents, internal policy documents and procedures are for doing that. So if you look at Google, for example, they've got a fairly large open source office, and they have open sourced their internal docs at opensource.google/docs. And so they sort of break it down into 3 different areas in terms of their policy that they outline. There's creating open source, there's using open source that's already been created by someone else, and then there's growing open source. So either growing open source at large or growing a project that you want to invest in as a core part of the technology that you use. So that could look like sponsorship of somebody else who's maintaining it, or having your own contributors contribute to that. So Microsoft has a very similar one, opensource.microsoft.com/program. And they say, okay, there's using, contributing, and releasing. So there's a couple of different ways and different examples from some fairly large organizations that sort of know the tech thing. And so, yeah, I guess the other part I'd say is that, you can look at examples of what exists out there in the wild. You can look at what your company needs. But the third area is to look at really standards. So there's a thing called the Open Chain project, and that's an international standard for open source license compliance. And then there's also clearlydefined.io, and that's going to be helping open source projects actually be clear about, well, what license do you use on this project? How hard is that to discover? What dependencies does your project have? So you can imagine that maybe I'm using project A in my company, which is open source created by somebody else, and it has, let's say, an MIT license. Okay, but then that project has a dependency in open source that it uses. And these are called like transitive dependencies or sub dependencies, and maybe that dependency has a different license. Is that license even compatible with the license that I'm using it under? These are all questions for, your legal group to figure out, and your automation and tools to really highlight for you. And then the last one is, and I find this one very helpful. It's called Reuse API. And it's like, if you're familiar with a linter goes through the code and, checks for common errors and not only compilation errors, but style errors, right? Well, reuse API is like a linter for your projects to be able to check the reusability. And a lot, if you check out how reuse API scans through a document or through a project, a lot of good policy could actually be derived from that knowledge. So that's a place to look, as well as the other organizations.
Awesome. We have, there's a bunch of comments in the chat just about licensing management, and you definitely touched on it, about it being blockers for organizations. Any other tips on how to manage them, or just how to not make bad decisions when it comes to licenses?
Yeah, so there are experts in this field. I am not one of them, but my advice is mostly to seek out those experts, whether it's consulting with a legal firm that's familiar with open source, getting mentored by a company who has an OSPO, who is dealing with this, especially large, ones like Microsoft or Google or somebody else, and the other piece would be to from a developer perspective and a software manager perspective, which is what I was in that last role, we don't really know the legal side. We can read these legal licenses and we can think we know what they mean, but we don't necessarily have all of the court cases, right at the top of our mind about some judge who decided what that actually is going to play out like, right? Which often some legal folks who have expertise in this do. So, buy some M&Ms, send them to your whoever your legal department is, and say, "Hey, I'm looking for a friend." Back in the days of actually being in person, I was able to, take the legal guy out to Starbucks and say, "So, open source licensing and our risk there," and he's like, "Oh, I'd love to talk about this." So, making partnerships and collaborating on it is the other big deal.
So, all about networking, and it sounds like, just from a policy and in some instances licensing as well, it sounds like there's an open source program office for open source program officing.
Yes.
A little bit.
Yes.
Now go figure, take advantage of the open source for that. So you're an organization, you're making like huge strides in setting up your OSPO, right? You got your goals, you've got your sponsorship, you've got a plan, and you've got resources, but like, what does that look like in an organization? Like, is it on the org chart? Are we talking like a little special project team that's kind of like little ninjas that go in and do things, or are we a legit like OSPO on the org chart? And where does that fall? What does that look like?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. I love the idea of little ninjas in an organization. maybe not a good business practice, but the idea that somebody is running around the rafters in the shadows, implementing great open source policy and letting that culture transform the business into a better state. Yeah, that's the dream. But besides that,
scale issues on that though.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think going back to kind of the core question about where does it fit in the organization, I think that done well, you could put it anywhere, but done well, from what I've seen just out in industry and from what I've tried to accomplish myself, is really it needs to be on the org chart. It needs to be established. It needs to not be shadow ops. It needs to be in the light. It needs to be recognized as aligned to strategy. So if one of the big thing or the big thing that your organization is focusing on is customer service, that's your big push for this year, and you need to make great strides in customer service. All the metrics are around that. Your open source programs office proposal and your goals and your metrics need to tie and be aligned to customer service, which is totally achievable for open source programs offices. There's a big customer impact, especially open sourcing example code on how to use your product or service, or I could get into a ton of things there. But back to the org chart part, but where on the org chart does it sit? A lot of times you'll see that open source programs offices are a programs office. Program management tends to, if you have a program management org, tends to be a natural fit for this. I have seen that some folks try to put this in their as a team underneath their legal group, and that could be okay to start, but it hasn't been a very accommodating long-term home for OSPOs from what I've seen. It tends to get spun up and then shut down once the policy is in place, almost like a tiger team or something. And once you have your policy, there's much more to work on. The story's not over, and the goals are not completely attained. So I wouldn't recommend, unless it's very short term, being under legal. Other healthy places that I've seen is a team underneath engineering or underneath the CTO, depending on how your org is structured. And then one that I'm semi-cautious on is under IT. So if you have a very well integrated IT that has positive relationship, not adversarial relationship with your developers, and your IT group is well networked into the actual business decision makers, so legal, your people who hold revenue as a part of their performance, and decision makers there. If they're well networked, then I've seen that work well. I've also seen it sort of be a silo. They implement things and it can be very heavy-handed or never really reach the developers. Like, oh, I didn't know we had a policy. It's been here for 3 years. Like, so yeah. And then I guess the other thing I'd say about like OSPOs and organizations and fitting them together is your working model of how the OSPO serves the rest of the organization is really important. So what I mean by that is like your OSPO could be like a toll gate on the road to delivering your products, right? So you can imagine that, okay, we've got this idea, we're coding this thing, and then right at the end, we check for security and make sure it's secure. We check for quality and make sure that we did all the right things. And then we check to make sure that it's, compliant with our open source policy. And then if we did something wrong, we have to like overhaul it and delay the release and all this stuff. It leads to approvers and signatures and meetings and delays, and it can not be very fun. But it might be the way that it fits into your organization, the way that it's structured right now. So something to consider. The alternative that I've seen be pretty successful is an OSPO as a service. And, I'm not just saying that because infrastructure is as a service and code is a service and everything is as a service these days. But to think about it as a service model and also as a self-service model. So you have a small team of people working for your large organization that is focused on creating your policies and helping projects get open sourced and manage those communities as you open source them. All of these different things that OSPO cares for, but you're automating those, right? And so if a team wants to use open source, they can fill out a form, and if it's already on the list, then boom, they're approved. And if it's not on the list, then so-and-so gets to check it and give the thumbs up or thumbs down and get it added to the list. Or even a self-service system for like, okay, how do I get a GitHub identity as a part of this organization and start contributing to my my organization's open source projects? Being able to just type your name in, have that all done for you, and then the person just gets a username and boom, they can go. I've seen that work really well. It helps with managing the size of the OSPO, being able to keep it small and focused on leverage points. So as you lean into automation, you're leveraging the fact that, okay, we decided how to do this once, and then boom, we implemented it everywhere and scaled it versus, okay, there's some legal person sitting in a basement somewhere reviewing each and every license on each and every project, and they start to, lose their mind a little bit because it's a very repetitive process, and it can be automated, it can be implemented as policy, and so then developers can really self-service on that.
That's awesome. And as you're describing this, I'm totally picturing like an org chart and seeing this little box move around in all the places that it can possibly go. And then eventually, like in my head, this box is getting smaller and smaller because of the number of people. But like, what is the mix of an OSPO? Like, is this people that are self-volunteering? Is it an actual like application you need to apply for it? Like, who are those people in that box on the org? Because you say it's under legal, and I'm like, ooh, these need to be all legal-minded people, but know how to code. Like, what's the right mix?
So the key is to focus on having a mix, right? So you're shooting for diversity and for all the benefits that that's going to give you in this area, right? You've got diversity of backgrounds. If you've got developer-minded folks, legal-minded folks, business-minded folks, that's how you're going to make a decision that is appropriate for the organization, and considering and weighing all of the different perspectives and factors, right? So what do those roles actually look like? Well, program management, like I mentioned already, is going to be a big one. Who's running your open source program as a whole and managing the measurement of it against its own goals, as well as maybe being a functional manager of people that are in that org. Then there's community managers. So you can imagine that you launch an open source project. It's maybe has some great engagement from the community. The community has questions, they have contributions, they have things. Somebody's gonna have to review that code. Somebody's gonna have to answer those questions and help set up the tone of the community too. Do people just get to come in on a GitHub issue and request that something be done by next week? Or is it that they propose things? Is it, do they have to be, the idea have to be approved before they start writing code? All of these workflows and just community management pieces around an open source project, that is what kind of a community manager focuses on. And so it can be also marketing, though. Your brand is out there when you start up an open source thing, and open source projects often, if they're large enough, have sub-brands of themselves. So you can think of, Google and Kubernetes are the first ones that kind of come to mind. Well, it's not called Google Neties, however you would say that, right? Like everything is not Google brand. It has its own sub brand, but that's aligned with, the parent brand, so to speak. Legal is also in there. So IP lawyers and developer relations is a common one. These are folks who know how to engage a community, know how to talk about products, and maybe in a way that doesn't seem like a sales pitch, right? And so there's also software engineers. There's a lot of automation to be built in programs offices, and it's really important to have a developer perspective. How do you know in your open source projects how easy it is to contribute to them if you don't have a developer looking at, like, what's that contribution pipeline? And how many legal waivers do I have to sign before I get scared to like even contribute to this? That's a whole thing. And then, product alignment and strategy alignment are the other ones. So getting business folks involved in that as well. Often there is like an OSPO, but then there's like an open source advisory board that sort of extends that OSPO into the network of the different parts of the organization. So that's a model to consider as well. But you should definitely be looking for thought leadership, people who understand the benefits of open source software and networkability into different parts of the organization. I think that covers it.
That's a good sized team and a lot of resources. Are we talking like, is this their 100% of their responsibilities? Is this in addition to their job, or
These are normally the folks where this is 100% of their job. I'm talking about, listing off all of these different roles as if they're different people. Sometimes it's the same person, a person who I worked with, a IP lawyer who also went through a CS degree. So he had the developer perspective and the legal perspective. That's a great leverage point to be able to just hire one person instead of two people who are going to argue a lot, maybe. So he just gets to argue in his head instead. There's that, but then there's also the scale of your organization that you need to consider. A startup would not hire 12 people with different they're going to hire somebody who can wrap their arms around it all, but maybe not be an expert at any one of them. When I started up in OSPO and proposed that, I said I would like to start it personally, one person, and I would like to grow to 3 people if I can hit these targets and these metrics. I'd like to, implement a policy. I'd like to do all this stuff, and then I'd like to bring on 2 developers and have them build some automation so we can get our license compliance in place. Or select a tool. And so you can grow. There's growth paths. You definitely don't have to I can't afford 12 people, so I can't OSPO. That's definitely not it. It can be as small as 1 person. I've seen people do this part-time, but just, word of caution, probably preaching to the choir here, but watch out for burnout, right? Yeah. So how many extra roles will you take on at your job before, you're on a path to just drown in the work and not be able to dig yourself out of it?
And you become that bottleneck, right, that everybody else is relying on because you're doing so many other things.
Mm-hmm.
But that totally leads perfectly into my next question, which is I've got these dedicated resources, whether it's 1, whether it's 12. How do I know that they're doing what we need them to do? How do we know this is successful, that I should be reinvesting and getting to that 3rd person or 12th?
Yeah, that's a good point. So from the organizations that I've been a part of, which are very data-driven organizations, and I find that most of the GitHub customers that I work with too are definitely that way.
Yeah.
And so they like to drive success based off of metrics, which is great. You're measuring something and you're seeing if you obtained it, and it's sort of your goal or your experiment. You're going to try it out, see how you do, and then you have data at the end of it of whether it worked or not. So that's how you know you've had success. But
data facts, right? Data.
Use
your facts.
Yes. But I think in practice, that's a lot harder than it sounds, especially folks get a lot of stage fright in choosing a metric. What if it's the wrong metric? What if I'm, measuring, my goal is here, but I'm sort of measuring this tertiary thing to try and see or gain insight into if I've achieved that goal. Ooh, well, if I don't hit it, my performance is tied to that, and my salary is tied to that. But also, maybe I accomplished the thing, but my metrics shows I did a poor job. How am I gonna do this? So, my first advice is to always seek help, collaborate on doing this. So there are people external to your organization that you don't even have to pay to do this. You can jump into todogroup.org, which is Talk Openly, Develop Openly. It's a group of open source programs offices. They have a Slack channel that's open to folks to be able to jump into and ask questions. Jump in there and ask other folks what metrics are driving your open source programs offices and see what you get. Or tell them, like I might have a couple of years ago, and say, well, I'm trying to drive, my open source programs office off of the metric of dollars saved by using open source instead of developing internally. If I had actually done that, I might have got some great advice to save me from a lot of pain that I went through of trying to explain when I tell the CTO, oh, well, we saved $3 million this year, by using open source instead of developing our own solution. And he kind of goes well, so where's the 3 million? Which account is that in? And I would like to redirect that to this other project I want to fund. And I go, well, I don't have the money right now. No, but it's funny money, so to speak. So you have to be very careful about the metrics you choose. There's tons of folks out there who are experts in this, and especially if you're open source. I talked about the to-do group, and that's very open source focused. There's also innersourcecommons.org. They also have a Slack channel where you can ask people who are actually doing this in their organizations and are experts at it, have done it maybe at many organizations. Hey, how do what metrics are good for measuring inner source? Here's my goals, and I'm struggling to find ways to do that. So reach out for help. There's tons of places to do that. I guess alignment is probably the other thing to talk about there, is just that your metrics should be answering a question, right? And that question should be at its core related to your goal. So maybe a question is, have we achieved legal compliance with our policy, which is designed to reduce our open source risk? So my metric for that is an output from maybe a tool that we've built, or maybe we're using FOSSA or something else that tracks what open source projects we have and what licenses we have and whether it complies against our policy. Then you have a report that says, okay, yeah, we shored up all the holes. We achieved success here. We've reduced our legal risk. Maybe your goal is, I want to make a big splash in open source. We have a lot of things that I think would be helpful for other folks to use outside of our company. And so I want to open source 10 projects by the end of the year. Good luck to you. Quantity is not quality. There's a lot of reasons I would say maybe this isn't a great goal, but just as an example, you can measure that. You can say, okay, well, GitHub repos that were public at the beginning of the year and GitHub repos that were public at the end of the year. And now if you want to improve the quality of that metric, you might say, okay, did I build a community around those? What type of user engagement did I have on a per project basis? So your OSPO might have its set of like parent goals and metrics, but then each open source or inner source project might have its own as well for the specific note that it's trying to hit. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So I mean, it's safe to say, and it's probably great for everybody here to hear this, that small wins are wins, right? So if you're just saying, I want to make sure that we're not opening any legal holes that's going to get us in a ton of trouble. Maybe that's not tangible, but it's definitely moving you in the right direction. So I would guess probably don't try and set your sights up here, rule the world. And like you said, have, 10, 20 open source projects by the end of the year, kind of make it fit for where you are in the process and for the size of your organization. Have you ever seen any examples of very unsuccessful? Oh, maybe not very unsuccessful, but just
wildly unsuccessful.
Not checking the box for a win. Have you seen any of those?
Normally I avoid talking about this type of thing, but since you asked so directly, I think that the common thing that I see that I find personally to be, I would even say extremely unsuccessful, is the theatricality of like our previous example of releasing 12 open source projects. I think when folks take all their old stuff and all of their this isn't core to our business stuff, and they don't think about whether it's actually useful for anyone else to use, they don't put any effort into building a community around it, or anything like that, or they put a policy in place and the policy is use good common sense when reading legal licenses, developer who was never trained to do this. Those type of things they're checking the box, and it's sort of like, this is a really big thing in innovation spaces. It's innovation theater is sort of the term. And so you're acting as if you're a really big deal in open source, and you can report back and say that, yeah, we released all these projects and we are an open source company and we are, inner sourcing everything because we made everything internally visible, but we have nothing written in a modular way so it could actually be reused. You're doing the play, but it's not reality. And that's where I think OSPOs are unsuccessful. Now, I don't see that a lot, thankfully. I think that the folks that are engaging in open source and inner source at a programs level, especially for these large organizations, are some of the most thoughtful people that I've just honestly ever met. They're very concerned about really doing this, and they have the right heart and goals in mind. Everybody's driven. Maybe some people find a moral imperative in open sourcing things. Other people just think that it's good for the world to share, or other people think that maybe this is specifically good for business. I could tell you that if some of the largest open source projects that we know of, like Linux or other things, if they weren't open sourced, would they have the adoption that they have? by their customers? Well, no. So, and billion-dollar businesses have been built around servicing and supporting those folks. So, yeah, there is a great business opportunity. And so my point is that everyone sort of comes at it for a different reason and a different, imperative of why to do this. And I think that those are all fine as long as you accomplish that goal. But I think if your goal is to look like other tech companies who are open sourcing things, and that's seen as like going to up your recruitment because you talk about open source in your application all the time, but none of it's really useful. It's an act, and it's a shame because it's a big missed opportunity. So, yeah.
So much like, right, any endeavor, an organization is going to change the way they're doing something. Start small, focus in on what's realistic rather than trying to accomplish the world in a small period of time. So that in a year you can look back and be like, look, we did these little things, but they're going to move us so much further forward over the next year, rather than looking back and saying, well, that was a disaster. Better luck next time. This OSPO stuff's just not for us. So, yeah, and you've definitely stressed the importance of leaning on the network and all the other lessons learned you can get from other organizations, so you don't take that year fretting and doing things wrong. You've mentioned a bunch of open source organizations and tools and stuff that that are out there that you can use, but are there any you want to recap on, or any additional ones you didn't mention that people should look to and leverage a little bit more on this endeavor?
Yeah. So To-Do Group, which has case studies, the Slack workspace, and tons of folks who are leading and participating in OSPOs. It's a great community. I think it's hosted by the Linux Foundation. There's a certain way to become a member, but you don't have to do that just to jump into the Slack and learn from folks. And so, yeah, I would especially dive into the case studies there if you're thinking about, like, how does this actually play out at companies, and even companies that you've heard of, right? And so you can help socialize the idea of an OSPO at your organization by sharing those. OSPO Con, which is a conference specifically about open source programs offices, that's coming up in September. Again, I think that's another Linux Foundation hosted deal. And I think that one's going to be part in person, part virtual, or I shouldn't say part, it's probably both, I think, for all the sessions. So I'm actually looking forward to that coming up later this year. And then if you are a government or a university, and the To-Do Group sounds interesting to you, but you have a little bit of this piece in your mind about, like, well, but it's different for tech companies. It's different in the private sector. How does this work in government and public universities and things? OSPO++, like actual plus sign. They are another group. They've got a Slack channel, community calls, Open RIT, which is the open source programs office from Rochester Tech. That community is going to be able to help you sort of see how open source is different, in some ways better, in government and in universities.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, and then the last one's just the innersourcecommons.org. That group is going to be the equivalent of the To-Do Group, but for the inner source side of things. And often, when you're looking at how to improve your engineering efficiency, consuming more open source is great, and even producing open source is great because you get contributions back. But a huge key for a ton of organizations is going to be the ability to reuse and share code inside of your organization's walls, so to speak. So, and that's really sort of what I mean by inner source.
Awesome. And I can imagine a lot of universities and government and tech companies probably do that quite well, or are starting to get on that bandwagon as well. Let's see, we're almost up on time, but do you have any parting words? Anything you want to reiterate on? Message to hamper down with? I think one of the big takeaways I got from this discussion with you is that there is a lot of work that does go into it. It is a real organization with real people and salaries, but it's such a positive investment for any company. If we're looking at the way of the world and 98% of software is built on open source, then you want to definitely put your money toward where it's going to get you the most value and the least amount of trouble out there in the world. Any parting thoughts or anything from you?
Yeah, I think I'll just mention, I feel like the one area maybe I talked around, and that's when you're starting an open source programs office for a lot of existing organizations, for a lot of the ones that I've worked with at least, this is a big change. When I introduced the idea that we were starting one, we'd already got approval. I had questions from employees about like, how come you think that it's okay to open source our crown jewels to everybody, expose all our flaws, and give away our software for free? And then they hand me back the mic in front of 500 people, and I'm like, okay, let's break that one down. This is not what that is doing. It's actually protecting us from doing that. And talking about all of the details thereof. So I think that the most important thing, if I could have you take away one thing from all of the details of why you should start an OSPO, is that the key to success with implementing an OSPO is to have an inspirational leader who can help folks in your organization, bottom to top, side to side, everywhere in the organization, understand clearly what the vision is. Today, we don't have an OSPO. In 3 years, if we had an OSPO, what will be different? Why will this have made an impact? And why is it so important that we do this right now? And I think that when you have a leader who's able to take that baton and sort of go around and light the candles of everybody else, and then you look back a year later or 2 years or 3 years, 5 years later, you see that glow of all of the candles, right? Everybody that sort of understands the idea and supports it and is contributing to it from their own perspective. That's when you get that beautiful picture of an organization who's living and breathing open source. You've got the diversity of perspective of all of those different folks contributing to it. And also, one thing that I'll note is that most people don't, at least everyone I know, doesn't live forever. They don't stay at a company forever. And so when that inspirational leader removes themselves from the organization, if you have lit all of those candles out there, then you have a much better chance of the program living on past you and continuing to reap benefits. And you've built something inside a company that's going to deliver fruit for that company way past your direct contribution to your time in that company. So I think that's a really magical thing. And that's sort of what I love planting the seed in different organizations for. So, yeah.
I love that. I love that analogy or just that picture, right? Because it's so much the momentum and building it to make it lasting instead of that just like one guy, running a marathon with a torch and everybody sees it, but they're, haven't gotten on the bandwagon. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. It's got to be someone that's going to help others with that momentum and keep it going for the long term.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I think we're about at time to wrap it up. I really appreciate you taking the time, talking to all of us, sharing your experiences and your genius and knowledge about all of this. And I know we've been talking at GitHub. We've been talking about open source all month, and I'm pretty sure you're involved in one of the next demo day sessions. Can you give us a little sneak peek on what's coming up next?
Yeah. So first, thank you for that. You were far too kind with the genius remarks. But yeah, I'm definitely going to tell my wife about that later. In terms of a sneak peek for next time, like you mentioned, been focusing with demo days on open source all month, and next month we'll really be transitioning into inner source. So these are both two very important components of an OSPO. So that fits into what we're talking about today. But looking into our journey ahead, if you're going to join us again next week for the inner source session that's first. We're going to be talking about sort of an inner source initiative. How do you start an inner source initiative? What are all the components? We'll get this very high level view of all the different pieces involved. And then in following sessions throughout the month, we'll be diving into each one of those different parts to try and give you some tangible takeaways and even code to help you manage an inner source initiative. So I am so excited that I got the opportunity to speak here today. This was super cool. It was great to go back and forth with you, Natalie. But I am equally excited for the sessions coming up. I think they're going to be really great. So hopefully we'll tune in for those and ask questions. We love the questions.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you again. Thanks to everybody for attending, and we'll call that another successful demo day. Thanks, everybody.
Great.
Well, here's the sleep shop's answer. Well, here's the sleep shop's answer.